In the beginning, we'll just watch our breaths and calm our minds, or some version of that. So if you have a different object that um, you develop your focus with, that's fine too. But it can be your breath, and you're just bringing your attention to your breath or the object of your meditation, and you're trying to develop a focused mind that's relaxed but vibrant. So not too agitated or excited, and not too dull, relax. And we'll just do that for a short period of time. And then with this relaxed but alert mind, then we can think about our motivation for listening to this talk, or reading these. We'll read a prayer, any kind of activity we engage in. So the first thing we'll do is try to reflect that all beings have been kind to us, directly or indirectly. And if you have a belief in reincarnation or an understanding of reincarnation, you can think all beings have been kind to me as a mother at some point. But if you have doubt around reincarnation, then it's sufficient to think all beings have been kind to me, directly or indirectly. Are you allowed to arise a natural sense of wishing to repay that kindness? And in the same way that you want happiness for yourself, then you know that others want various levels of happiness. And so you can develop the wish for others to have happiness and causes of happiness. And we'll call that the mind of love. So developing a mind of love towards those beings who have been a mother to you. And then in the same way you want to be free from all the various levels of suffering, then you can uh, wish the same thing for these living beings who have at some point been a mother to you. Then we'll call that the mind of compassion. So the wish for beings to be free of the causes and conditions for suffering. And then we don't merely have to wish it, but we can take a responsibility to cause those things to happen. So we can take universal responsibility to free beings from suffering and to uh, engender happiness within them, to give them causes and conditions for happiness, to free them from causes and conditions for suffering. So take that responsibility. So I alone will do this for others. These other beings who have been my mother and been so kind to me. And then we can evaluate our ability to do that for others. So we take a realistic assessment of our qualities. We don't always say the right things. We don't always do the right things. We don't always think things that are particularly helpful. And so we have some limitations. But at the same time, we have this great potential. So according to um, Buddhist teachings, we can develop all the positive qualities that humans have infinitely, because our minds are flexible, and because the nature of the mind is congruent with or concordant with positive qualities. So it supports those positive qualities by its nature. So we can develop our generosity and our patience and our ethics and concentration and perseverance and wisdom and those kinds of things. So develop the motivation to develop those qualities perfectly. And so in this, in our philosophical system, we call that becoming a Buddha. So develop the wish to become a Buddha so that you can free beings from suffering and help them attain happiness as a way of thanking them for how they've been kind to you directly and indirectly. And if you can develop that sense of wanting to become a Buddha, then once you have that desire, that wish, or that resolve, maybe is even a better word, then um, then kind of hold on to the feeling in the same way you might watch your breath. So you sort of focus on it in a relaxed but alert kind of way. And if you're unable to generate that feeling, then you start in the beginning with remembering the kindness of beings and then working your way through those kind of that path that we kind of went through until you can try and get feeling for that sense of resolve. And we'll just stay on it for a couple of minutes, maybe 5 minutes. So far in the course, we've talked about the need to have a teacher. So think if you've had if you have a teacher or so, someone you'd consider a teacher, then we'll just take a few minutes. Just remember their kindness. Mm. So perhaps they um, offered you an insight or an instruction, or uh, you've witnessed them do something or whatever it is. Um, and then just remember that kindness. And then just develop some sort of sense that this kindness is no different from what the Buddha would have done for me or is willing to do for me. If I were in front of the Buddha um, himself. And just begin to blend the two kindnesses, so you can begin to see, oh, my teacher's kindness, the Buddha's kindness are no different. And so in a sense, they're no different. And then think, um, over time, I will train myself to see a qualified teacher, my qualified teacher. I'll train myself to see him as indistinguishable from a Buddha, so that I can benefit by relating to that person in that way. And over time, I will develop the ability to, um, serve them with material goods or offerings, service, acts of service. But most importantly, I will follow their teachings. And then in our case, because of this particular kind of Buddhism in our school, so we practice the lamrim. So the next we think about that we've attained, or we consider the possibility that we've attained precious human existence or rebirth, they say, precious human rebirth, precious human existence, which is to say that I'm free of various gross levels of suffering and distraction. And I have access to Buddhist teachings and communities. Uh, I have a body that allows me to study and practice. So I have freedoms from suffering and distraction, and endowments or special qualities that make practicing possible. And I try and develop a sense without going through the whole outline of precious human rebirth. I just develop a general sense that I have what I need to do this. This is a great opportunity, essentially. I have a great opportunity to develop spiritually for the benefit of others. And then we talked about death and impermanence as one of the first lamrim topics. All of this has been lamrim, but so one of the topics for the lower scope. And we think death is certain. So what I mean to say is that I will die or you will die. So it is certain that will happen. So we think there's no being on earth that hasn't there's no ordinary being on earth who hasn't been subject to death. There's no way to reverse it that we know of through science or um, through modern science or through even mystical practice. There's no way that it's been reversed. So each second or each heartbeat or each breath is one fewer from the total collection of seconds or heartbeats or breaths that in this worldview is already sort of determined by karma in a sense. And in the lamrim outline, they say there's never enough time to practice Dharma. So the conclusion is we should practice Dharma or practice the Buddhist teachings, practice Dharma. Another way is to say we'll develop our minds, develop ourselves spiritually. And we reflect on the point that the time of death is uncertain. So we can think that all the conditions that that we think of as supporting our lives can quickly become conditions for the end of our lives. So we think of our house as protecting our lives until there's an earthquake or something similar and it falls on us. Or we think that medicine protects our lives until the dosage is wrong, or we take the wrong thing and it kills us. And there's lots of different things like that, whereas where the things that seem to protect life actually can endanger us as well when we least suspect it. And we could think how our bodies are so fragile. So, you know, things like tiny microbes or viruses and things, we can become infected and be gone in a week or two. And we can overheat and drink too much water and eat too much. And so even though we have a kind of felt sense that we're sort of solid and okay, we're actually, very, very fragile, actually. Our bodies are fragile. And then we can think that, according to traditional texts, there's no fixed lifespan. So in traditional texts, there are certain beings that have fixed lifespans, but humans is not one of those. And another way of looking at that is that there's no clear sign that death is imminent relative to another human being's. So just because I'm old doesn't mean I'm going to die before someone who's young. Just because I'm sick doesn't mean I'm going to die before someone who's not sick. Just because I'm injured doesn't mean I'm going to die before someone who's not injured. There's just no clear signs. we can't say definitively if we took two people side by side. Mm, So we might be able to talk in terms of probabilities, which are fine, but not in terms of certainties. So because this person has this disease, that they'll necessarily die before I do. And so we try and develop the conclusion. mm, um, I I will practice Dharma now. There's no time to delay. I'll practice Dharma now. And then we think only pure Dharma, if you will, only Dharma um, is important at the time of death. So we think um, my um, material possessions and different accomplishments, they won't mean anything at the time of death. I won't be able to take them with me. Where I live, special objects I've received over time, um, things I've put in great effort into, they don't come. They don't come with you, or don't come with me, right? And we think our family and loved ones, they also are not helpful at the time of death, in the sense that they can't come with you. You're separated from them. And for ordinary beings, from the perspective of this tradition, ordinary beings aren't able to um, consciously manipulate the quality of their future life. So you can't guarantee you'll ever meet these people easily again, or perhaps not at all. You might not recognize them, and mhm. And we think our body can't help us at the time of death, in the sense that it can't come with us. And we put in all this effort and worry and heartache into our bodies. They just become part of the physical universe, go through the recycling process of the physical universe. So the conclusion is only the pure, I will practice the pure Dharma now, which is to say that I will work on my mind. I will work on cause and effect, or my karma. And I will develop myself spiritually as much as possible. because mm, the continuity of the subtlemost consciousness is the only thing um, that will determine the quality of your next life. Mm, and so only the pure Dharma can, only practicing making an impact on the subtle most level of mind is the only thing that sort of can come with us, if you will. Mm. And we think, okay, so what are my priorities for my life right now? Knowing that it's certain I will die, but its time is uncertain. I don't know if I'll get to the next day. I don't know if I'll get to the next hour. I don't know if I'll get to the next minute. So, what's most important is the content of my mind, that I keep it quote unquote in Dharma or informed by the teachings as much as possible. Okay. So then when you're ready, you can open your eyes. You can relax your body posture if you need to. And then if we could put up the foundation of all good qualities. Thank you. So so that so so that anyway, I'll read the prayer first and then I'll talk. So this prayer, for those who don't know, is by Lama Tsongkhapa um, from the 1400s. Um, and this is a lamrim prayer. So you'll see elements of what we kind of thought about together in the first two stanzas. And then we'll talk about the other stanzas as this course goes on. The foundation of all good qualities is the kind and perfect pure guru. Correct devotion to him or her is the root of the path. By clearly seeing this and applying great effort, please bless me to rely upon him or her with great respect. Understanding that the precious freedom of this rebirth is found only once is greatly meaningful and is difficult to find again. Please bless me to generate the mind that unceasingly, day and night, takes its essence. This life is as impermanent as a water bubble. Remember how quickly it decays and death comes. After death, just as a shadow follows the body, the results of black and white karma follow. Finding firm and definite conviction in this, please bless me always to be careful to abandon even the slightest negative action and accomplish all virtuous deeds. Seeking samsaric pleasures is a door to all suffering. They are uncertain and cannot be relied upon. Recognizing these shortcomings, please bless me to generate the strong wish for the bliss of liberation. Led by this pure thought, mindfulness, alertness, and great caution arise. The root of the teachings is keeping the pratimoksha vows. Please bless me to accomplish this essential practice. Just as I have fallen into the sea of samsara, so have all mother transmigratory beings. Please bless me to see this, train a supreme bodhichitta, and bear the responsibility of freeing transmigratory beings. Even if I develop only bodhichitta, but I don't practice the three types of morality, I will not achieve enlightenment. With my clear recognition of this, please bless me to practice the bodhisattva vows with great energy. Once I have pacified distractions to wrong objects and correctly analyzed the meaning of reality, please bless me to generate quickly within my mind stream the unified path of calm abiding and special insight. Having become a pure vessel by training in the general path, please bless me to enter the holy gateway of the fortunate ones, the supreme Vajra vehicle. At that time, the basis of accomplishing the two attainments is keeping pure vows and samaya. As I've become firmly convinced of this, please bless me to protect these vows and pledges like my life. Then, having realized the importance of the two stages, the essence of the Vajrayana, by practicing with a great energy, never giving up the 4 sessions, please bless me to realize the teachings of the Holy Guru. Like that, may the Gurus who show the noble path and the spiritual friends who practice it have long lives. Please bless me to pacify completely all outer and inner hindrances. In all my lives, never separated from perfect Gurus, may I enjoy the magnificent Dharma. By completing the qualities of the stages and paths, may I quickly attain the state of Vajradhara. Okay. So that was a much longer intro than before, but we got to go over the outline with a little bit more slower and a little bit from more of a feeling practice side than just the analytical or just the conceptual side, maybe just the talking about it side. But were there any questions or anything before I go into the next topic? I just want to make sure I create space. Okay. If no, no problem on my side. Okay. So the next topic in that lamrim, so we're going through the lamrim. You have guru devotion, precious human rebirth. They sort of set the stage, if you will. They're how you're able to, they're sort of the how you're able to practice, the sort of basic conditions that are needed to practice successfully. Then move into death and impermanence. And you can see its function is to make one question their priorities, how they're spending their time, how they're spending their life. So time, from one perspective, is a finite resource, and what's going to matter to you in the long run. So there's a built-in answer. So it's practicing the Dharma. And then so then the next topic. So the next topic is starting to begin to think about the various kinds of suffering that beings experience. And they do this through looking at the Buddhist cosmology, the sort of the structure of the Buddhist universe. So the Buddhist universe is divided into realms, and there's a form realm, formless realm, desire realm. So the form realm and the formless realm contains, according to Buddhist cosmology, contains beings that through their experience of meditation have developed certain kinds of karmas that have ripened in these realms, where they experience subtle minds and subtle bodies, and it feels very good. and it's still considered a kind of suffering, because when those karmic lifespans run out, then they may have to come back to the desire realm, which is where humans are considered part of, and relatively it's more suffering. So they're suffering in that they have a time limit to them, and it may exhaust one's kind of positive potential, and then you have to come back to something that's kind of more grossly more suffering. You haven't actually stopped the process of um, rebirth. Now, the desire realm contains us human beings. So above us, the so-called higher rebirths include the God realm, demigod realm, and humans in the desire realm. And then the so-called lower rebirths include animals, hungry ghosts, and hell beings. Now, it's important to consider, well, it's important to remember that from the Buddhist worldview, mm, these are seen as literal places. Uh, they're seen as literal possibilities for how a mind. So a person is a mind in a body. A human is a mind in a body. So a mind can take different forms, and so this is taken as literally true. I just think that's important to mention, because when you talk to Tibetan teachers, that's their worldview, that these things exist, and they seem pretty obvious. And and I think that's helpful to keep in mind, because when you read some types of Buddhism, often from converts who didn't grow up in Buddhist cultures and societies, then they're often phrased as kind of purely psychological states. And there's nothing wrong with approaching it from that way too. It's just, I just like to mention that for practicing Buddhists all around the world, millions and millions of people, these are not just psychological states. They're literal states that people can be in. Although I do think it is helpful to talk about in terms of psychological states. So when they describe the beings, sometimes they're talked about in terms of the dominant psychological state which they have. So God realms, I've actually forgotten what the God realm is. The God realm, their dominant state, I think it's one of intense pleasure or distraction, maybe. I have to think about that more carefully. But it said in the God realm, the pleasures are so blissful, everyone's beautiful, and so forth, that they get so distracted that they don't engage in spiritual practice. And so, since they don't engage in spiritual practice, when their karmic lifespan runs out, then they have visions, or they get the knowledge. They somehow learn that they're going to go to a lower rebirth within the desire realm, and relatively that's so painful that it causes them to freak out in chaos. So I think that's interesting. There's for in terms of there are people out there in the world, humans out there in the world, that experience such intense pleasure that they are sort of oblivious to how things work in the real world. So if we think of these families or people that make a lot of money very fast, how does that influence your mind? I think that's interesting to think about. Below them are the demigods. And so the demigods are characterized principally by their jealousy towards the gods. So there's an underlying insecurity, and jealousy, and planning to war them, or take them over. So 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 from so so yes, a literal possibility in the Buddhist world, but also helpful to look at from a psychological point of view as well. So extreme jealousy, that kind of suffering that arises when you're never satisfied with what you have, even though relative to all the forms below you, you're actually doing really well. But you're so disturbed by who's above you that you don't even enjoy it or perceive your relative enjoyments. So as humans, we've all experienced that kind of jealousy where we can't even see the good in our lives because we're so worried about what someone else has accomplished or doing. Then we have human realms, um, and relatively they're well, actually maybe I'll skip over humans, so I'll come back to humans. Then we go down to animal realm, and so they're characterized principally by their ignorance. Yeah, by their ignorance, which is to say that they're uh, studying spirituality, reasoning, you know, um, is difficult. They don't have the apparatus or the inclinations to learn these kinds of spiritual paths. They eat each other, they attack each other. Um, there's, yeah, ignorance. Then underneath them, hungry ghosts, and that's principally the energy of um, craving or attachment. And so these beings are said to, because of the intense nature of their craving or attachment, they take forms that cause them to be perpetually unsatisfied. So you hear various descriptions, but sometimes you hear descriptions like um, their necks are thin as needles and no food or water can go down, and even if it goes down, it turns into molten iron in their stomachs. And when they're constantly hungry and thirsty and they're never able to be satisfied, and if they go to a body of water or they see food, it turns into filth and pus and blood. And so you get these kind of intense descriptions of someone who's just starved, craving and can't do anything to satisfy it, hungry ghosts. And in the human realm we can see that kind of craving too, where people just cannot be satisfied. I mean, I think we primarily think of addictions in that kind of form, even though it's bad for the person. They keep pursuing. It's never going to stop, really, that kind of energy. And we've all seen that in ourselves to some degree. And then we have hell beings, and hell beings are principally characterized by hatred, um, just wanting to destroy people and things they dislike or hate or displease them. That's going to just hatred. And the hell realms are divided into 16, and they get worse and worse and worse. And there's all kinds of horrific traditional descriptions of these realms of, it's not very dissimilar from other religions. Fire and swords and frozen tundras and stuff like that. Just extreme suffering. Um, and we can see that in the human world too, when someone's so full of hatred, the chaos and just suffering that they cause people. And we've seen that very recently, in the past week in the United States anyway, but it happens all over the world. The just hatred, it destroys people from the inside. It causes them to do things that are um, uh, destructive and awful, right? And then I'm going back to the human realm. So the human realm, comparative in comparison to the two upper realms, the God realm and the demigod realm, we're suffering relative to those to those rebirths. Relative to the ones below us, we're in bliss. And so it's said that the human realm is sort of a good um, balance, if you will, between extreme bliss that causes us to be distracted and confused and waste our time and be unconcerned about people or beings, and extreme suffering where we're so engrossed in our own suffering that we can't concentrate on spiritual paths, we can't concentrate on others because we're just trying to get out of it. So we're kind of in the sweet spot according to the Buddhist worldview. In addition, so when we talk about precious human rebirth earlier in the lamrim prayer, for example, they precious human rebirth has 8 freedoms and 10 endowments or opportunities sometimes. So 8 freedoms. Well, some of those freedoms are these realms. We're free from the hell realm. We're free from the animal realm. We're free from hungry ghost realm and the other realms, and then some extra ones. Humans are characterized by I don't know, maybe desire. I heard one person tell me, although I can't remember the lama who they learned it from, but that human beings have desire and busyness. So there's always something that needs to be done or accomplished. And so for us, that can also waste our time or distract us. And so you can see, going to the meditations on death, those preliminary meditations on death are to help us curb that tendency. There's always something that our priorities are sort of misaligned according to Buddhist perspective. There's always something we could do to acquire material possessions, or work on families and relationships, or put energy into our bodies. There's always stuff that needs to be done. So I thought that was an interesting description, although I can't remember which lama I heard that from. But what do you all? So this is all to say that ordinary beings are suffering. Those are just a description of those states. And the reason we get another opportunity to reflect on suffering later in the lamrim, when we get to the middling scope. And so later in the lamrim, when we're reflecting on suffering, those are the kinds of, they talk about, like, I'm trying to think of this is kind of suffering, like, there's gross suffering, and even your pleasures is a kind of suffering, and you'll be removed from the things you like, and you'll have to engage with things you don't like, and you'll suffer all through these suffering states, these human jealousy, human anger, human attachment, human ignorance. And so later we go through suffering again. And they add, in addition to all of it, you will go through this cycle of samsara. You'll develop karma on the basis of afflictions, and on the basis of afflictions, you'll develop karma. That karma will propel you, and that constant cycle is something worth getting off of. So maybe you can transcend it. So now we're in the middle. We're in the middle scope. When I'm talking just about the realms, we're still in the lower scope. The reason is because in the beginning, they just are. Lama Atisha, who wrote Lamp for the Path of Enlightenment, Lama Tsongkhapa, who wrote Foundation of Good Qualities on the basis of Lama Atisha's teachings. You only talk about these realms of existence without the samsara part, without the cycling part, because all you're trying to do is convince people to want to avoid the upper realms, to avoid the lower realms. You just want to convince people to want to get the 3 higher rebirths. Sorry, I'm using rebirths and realms interchangeably, which is actually a little bit confusing. But you want to, in this point of the lamrim, the lower scope, they talk about the 3 realms. They concentrate on the desire realm, which has 6 rebirths, including human, and they're encouraging people to want to avoid the lower rebirths, animal, hungry, ghosts, hell beings. And that's the lower scope, the beginning of that. This is what makes you a spiritual practitioner. You're now concerned about the quality of your future life more than you are about the quality of your present life. And that's what makes you a spiritual person. And so once you've convinced someone, oh, it's worth not being reborn in these 3 lower realms, then the question is, well, how do you do that? And the very short, simplified answer is, oh, you take refuge. You take refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. And then you start watching your actions. You start watching your karma, your volitional actions, your karma. So after you meditate on the suffering of the realms, then one develops a sort of fear, essentially, but a practical fear. And you're like, oh, I don't want that. So then the next thing they say, oh, take refuge in Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. So then what does that mean? So then, very simply stated, we have Buddha as the teacher, Dharma as the teachings, Sangha as the community of practitioners that have thoroughly accomplished those teachings. They're sort of proof that people can accomplish those teachings. And in terms of analogy, you could think of Buddha as the doctor, Dharma as medicine, Sangha as the support staff, nurses, support staff. So what do we mean by Buddha? So sometimes when they talk about, this is just a summary of the refuge teachings, sometimes they talk about the 3 jewels of refuge as having absolute and relative natures, or that doesn't make sense, not natures, categories. So you have the absolute Buddha and the relative Buddha, the absolute Dharma and the relative Dharma, absolute Sangha and relative Sangha. The absolute Buddha is the mind of the Buddha, defined as a mind that's developed compassion completely and totally, and developed their understanding of reality as it is completely and totally. So they develop the compassion wing of the path and the wisdom wing of the path perfectly. So the absolute Buddha is a mind that has those qualities. And then the relative Buddha is, just for the context of this teaching, we can say it's the historical Buddha, or the Buddha that taught the teachings on earth. We could say that. Or you could even say a Buddha. Yeah, maybe that's the easiest way. Yeah. The absolute Dharma is the realizations of the teachings. So the teachings cause you to develop this understanding about death, this understanding about generosity, this understanding about concentration, for example. I'm just choosing random things. So all the realizations are the absolute Dharma. Those are the things, those are the teachings, and their manifestations in our own mind is what we want. So when we want to achieve those dharmas, we want to practice those dharmas and achieve those dharmas. And then the relative dharma, we could just say, for the sake of this talk, we could say it's the dharma written in books, or in a podcast, or in a video, or something. The teachings, readily accessible for us to think about and learn from. The absolute Sangha is superior beings or extraordinary beings. They've developed some level of insight in their minds, and this includes bodhisattvas of different levels, and yeah, basically all the beings that have realized emptiness in some sort of way, through all the different levels that occurs at. So they're the Arya Sangha. And then the relative Sangha is the ordained monks and nuns. And the reason they're mentioned in particular is because there are texts where Buddha says that the Dharma remains where there's a collection of fully ordained monks and nuns. And so maintaining that ordination lineage is really important in the Buddhist world tradition. Sometimes, and you see this a lot, sometimes you see different organizations refer to Sangha as the collection of students in the organization. And it's helpful to realize there's this sort of third way of using that word. In some ways, I think it's helpful because that helps us get a sense of all the different students that are in the organization, but it's not strictly, it might not strictly be, so you might not find that, I'm not sure you'll necessarily find that in the traditional text, the older texts, that kind of idea of Sangha. Sangha is really for the monks and nuns. And in some ways and this is coming to me as I'm thinking right now, so this might be only a half-formed idea, but in some ways it makes sense that Sangha doesn't refer to the entire community, because when we take refuge, we direct our minds towards objects that have qualities we want to embody as spiritual ideals. And if that includes everybody at every single level, then it ceases to make sense. But fully ordained monks and nuns have made a kind of commitment which separates them from the rest of all the different levels of students you would find in a center. So I think that's why they're sort of given that special categorization. I don't know, this is just a theory I'm having in the moment. Because if you go to certain Buddhist centers and they say, well, the Sangha is having a potluck today, they're really referring to everyone, every single member, every single, no matter what their age or how much they've studied or how many vows they've taken, or and so then uh, why would you put a special kind of trust or faith to learn from those people? So I think that makes sense to me. But what do you let me just open it up for discussion. What are you all thinking about these realms or psychological states that the realms can represent? Or we didn't really go into refuge yet, but I just wanted to see where people were at. They had questions or ideas or comments or anything at all.
You said something about in the desire realm that there were 6 rebirths.
Yeah.
Did I hear? Can you explain that? I've never heard that before.
Yeah. So in the desire realm, there's 6 sort of like broad categories of sentient being. God beings, demigods, humans, animals, hungry ghosts, and hell beings. So that makes six broad categories of beings within the desire realm. And then there's 3 realms: form realm, formless realm, desire realm. And the form and the formless realms are realms that are said to arise from meditative concentration. And so they're characterized by very subtle mind and body. Sometimes there is no body, and there's kind of blissfulness or sort of dissing, there's so much bliss and concentration, you're sort of checked out. I don't know, that might be a little bit of a judgment. Yeah.
I think you started to touch on the types of suffering, like the suffering of change and
Yeah.
the suffering of pain, but I didn't hear. Could you talk a little about all pervasive suffering? Because I think that one can be tricky.
I mean, have you heard about it before, or do you have a question, or
No,
was
just
it
sort of.
just an oversight?
No. I just read about it recently, and
Oh,
it helps me to hear it from different
okay.
perspectives to just
Yeah,
understand it better. So in this
yeah,
context, it'd be nice to hear about it.
yeah. Okay. Yeah. So they talk about the 3 kinds of suffering. So as you mentioned, suffering of suffering. So that's the gross suffering we're all used to. And then suffering of change. This is essentially that what we perceive as pleasure is actually in the nature of suffering. So that an imperceptible level of cold suffering feels like bliss relative to gross heat suffering until I'm too cold. And now I have gross cold suffering and very small heat suffering. So then I go into the heat, and then I have gross heat suffering, but very small cold suffering, and I keep exchanging. I kind of just keep exchanging. So to be full of food is suffering. To be starving is suffering. To be just right is not to notice that you're too full or too starving. So you're not even that pleasure is actually in the nature of suffering at some point. Suffering of all pervasive compounding suffering is the idea that um, we have our minds have um, delusions in them or afflictive emotional states. So the big ones are attachment and hatred. Attachment and hatred on the basis of ignorance. And then you can divide attachment and hatred. There can be other things off the base on the from within those, right? Jealousy and different subtleties and nuances to those kinds of feelings. And then on the basis of those afflictions that arise in our minds, that are based on a misapprehension of reality as it is, we engage in volitional action. Those volitional actions, if they're considered fully complete, which we'll maybe talk about in next session, if we engage in a fully complete karma, then an aspect of that is the energy which propels us into a next life, that throws us, so it's called throwing karma, throws us into a next life, and that causes us to be reborn, which causes us to have a body that still has an afflicted mind, and then we engage, and thus we can experience those levels of suffering again, gross suffering and suffering of change. And then we get new volitional action that throws us again at death to another rebirth. Then we have another body again, so we can have gross suffering and suffering of change. So it's this endless cycle, because the argument is that we haven't eradicated ignorance, therefore we haven't eradicated a host of other afflictive actions. And since we haven't eradicated those afflictive actions, then we engage in karmas, volitional actions, and those karmas propel the cycle again, and so around and around. That's a little bit of a summary. There's more to it that has to do with the 12 links of dependent origination. Have you heard that phrase?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I don't think I really know them well enough to describe them off the top of my head, but there's a whole book by His Holiness that goes through each link. And that set of 12 links is pervasive, is that suffering, all pervasive compounding suffering, that you're accumulating karmas that propel that cycle forward, constantly accumulating different karmas that propel that cycle forward. So in summary, is that helpful or more confusing? Or
Yeah, very helpful. Would a fully enlightened being still experience these three forms of suffering, or do they know, or do they experience them differently? Or not?
they would say that a fully enlightened being is not capable of experiencing any of those sufferings.
Mm.
They would say, yeah, by definition, they've stopped the cycle of those 12 links, so they don't have volitional karma based off of afflictive emotions. So it's not like they have ordinary hatred that causes them to kill somebody, which is a karma that would propel them to another life, probably a suffering one. They've developed their compassion to such an intense level that all their activity is on the basis of that compassion. And so it's not volitional in an ordinary sense. It comes only from the activity only comes from I think the development of bodhichitta, like their desire to benefit beings. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it might be a dumb question, but like, can an enlightened being like stub their toe and hurt? Or is it different?
No, that's good. That's good. I think there's some, it's not conclusive in some ways, because different Buddhist traditions will be like, well, what does a Buddha really experience? In some ways, in some schools, it seems like, let's say, so I'm an ordinary being, so I meditate and I somehow become enlightened. My body is still from a past karma, And so it is sort of subject to ordinary experiences. Like it will get sick and decay at some point. But then that's an interesting question. Yeah. So, but then what's the quality of my mind? I don't know if I have. I don't have a conclusive answer. I can only debate. So I think it'd be interesting. So as an ordinary being, I've developed sort of perfect compassion. I understand reality it is, and my concentration is perfect. I mean, even they say, even if you have developed calm abiding, which is like this kind of preliminary kind of concentration you need even to do all the other part of the path correctly, even if you're in a state of calm abiding, your gross afflictions are not completely eradicated, but they're tamed thoroughly. And I don't think you would experience ordinary, I don't think you'd experience ordinary pain. And in fact, there are reports of Thai Buddhist meditators who have done surgeries without anesthesia, just doing meditation and stuff. So I would say that they don't experience an probably ordinary kind of pain, even just by virtue of just their concentration alone. But I don't know this definitively. I'm just putting lots of things together that I've read and trying to make my own. Well, what do you think based off of what you've read so far?
Yeah, well, yeah, I read about this one monk, Phakya Rinpoche, who kind of like healed his leg from gangrene, which isn't a normal thing to be able to heal. And I've also just experienced meditation can eliminate pain, actually, just through concentration. So I think what you said about concentration makes sense to me from just my own experience in a small way. How if your mind was that, I don't know, able to perceive reality of even a painful event, like it wouldn't be perceived as pain in the same way. So yeah, I think it makes sense, but I'm not quite as read as you, so I just can kind of agree a little bit. I can't go much deeper into the reasoning.
Yeah, we'll have to research. The Dalai Lama wrote these great lamrim commentaries that I recommend all the time. They are called actually I'm going to be on the internet with everyone. Wisdom Publications, Dalai Lama, Lamrim. I think they're called no, that's not it. They're called like the Library of Wisdom and Compassion, or let me see. I'm almost there. That's the cover. Not that one.
Is it the ones with Tupten children?
Yeah. Yeah, the Library of Wisdom and Compassion. They're going to release a new volume soon about emptiness. And those commentaries are so good. And those, if you haven't read them already, those kinds of questions you have, I think His Holiness touches on kind of briefly. But I couldn't tell you which volume off the top of my head. Have you read them all already?
I'm reading. That's what I was reading. All pervasive suffering from yesterday,
Okay.
and
Yeah.
the question. Yeah, so I'm working on those.
Yeah, they're great books. Really, very, very, very clear. Yeah. Were there any other questions or comments, or you don't have to agree on anything? You can, no problem.
I kind of accept the fact that these three realms and six categories exist on some literal level that is unseen. But I think if it exists there, then it probably has correlations or correspondences to an individual life so that it would exist on the psychological level as well.
Mm.
And so if that's happening on the micro level, like we have the opportunity to, if we are in that kind of psychological God realm, to not become like narcissistic and
Mm.
uncaring and to seek balance. And, um, I think most of us probably would say we've been a hell being at least for a couple of moments
Hmm.
somewhere. And it's like, how do you pull yourself, how do you lift yourself out of that? What is the antidote in a sense? And I'm not sure if there would be correlates to this macro level, which is over the course of many lives. But it seems like it would happen. If it's happening at the mind level, it would happen
Mm.
somewhere at the physical level and the emotional, psychological level. And I'm just wondering if anybody has written anything about, um, you know, um, and I'm thinking like in other cultures, there may have been like an attempt to identify these, like in Greek tragedies, like this kind of these stories, these cautionary tales. But I'm wondering if anybody has written about it from a psychological perspective, and do these kind of correspond to, personality types or psychoanalysis, like with maybe like the demigod and the human realms being very egocentric versus like getting into like the id at the lower levels. And I guess the only like I would like to read something about that if it exists, and I haven't really
Uh,
looked. I'm gonna look.
yeah.
But
Yeah.
there's also this kind of like there's it looks like it's kind of like a continuum, like a vertical continuum of hell beings being the lowest, but the god being the god level being the highest. And so, but each of them has like, like even the God level has like a pitfall of like being too
Hmm.
kind of complacent or, I don't know why when you were talking about it, I was just thinking of Jeff Bezos, like
Oh, maybe.
he has everything,
Yeah.
and yet like he's not really aware of the suffering that he's causing. So, there's, it seems like every single one of these has some sort of mixture of like good and bad, like psychologically, that
Oh,
that you're not like the higher on the level you go, maybe your status or your type of suffering or your type of challenge is different, but you're never really free of all
uh,
of these problems until
uh,
you kind of graduate. You don't graduate up, you have to kind of graduate out. I
yeah.
don't
No,
know.
that's brilliant. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, no, that's exactly how they see it. As long as you're in one of those three realms, formless, form, desire, and particularly if you're in any of those re those levels of rebirth in the desire realm, God, demigod, human, etc., you are suffering. Although relative to each other, they experience a certain kind of bliss. So that the formless realm is more blissful and form realm, and God realm is more blissful, and demigod more blissful. So relative to each other, but it's not complete. And that's what, when you said about graduating out, that's exactly how they describe it. You've got to get off this cycle. And the easiest way to do that from their perspective is to be a human practicing Dharma. And it's because of that sweet spot between gross pleasure and gross pain, and the faculties required to um, look at look at philosophical texts, engage in the meditations, engage in um, virtues and avoid non-virtues, and understand why you would do that. And yeah, 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 everything you said makes a lot of sense. I think one interesting thing about talking about the psychology is that if you read about from a Western psychological point of view, oftentimes the same words are used, but they're used in completely different ways. And I think it causes a great deal of confusion sometimes for people, because we can talk about the hatred that causes a hell being existence. And then we could talk about the hatred, like I hate my parents, or they were mean to me, or something like that. Or anger. Let me use a better word, anger. So sometimes you'll see the same translation, anger, but the Western world uses the word anger differently from the Buddhist world. From the Buddhist worldview, and it's very helpful to get your definitions as clear as possible. So those Dalai Lama lamrim commentary in the early books, he'll start to go through the definitions of minds, and it the reason it's helpful is because sometimes, we're traversing worldviews, right? When we're reading about Dharma stuff, we're trying to get a Buddhist worldview and we're interested, and when we're with our Buddhist friends, we kind of, and then when we're in the outside world trying to talk to people about anger, they're like, what do you mean I can't have anger? Like, they crossed my boundary. And I do counseling, I do like therapy as my day job. And so it's important to make that distinction, because from one point of view, it's like, okay, yeah, someone crossed your boundaries, say you're angry. Okay, that's not so problematic in some ways. But the anger that they're talking about in Buddhism, maybe one simple definition is exaggerating the negative qualities of phenomenon and seeking to destroy it or remove yourself from it. Well, that's different from just crossing your boundaries, and you not getting what you want. Is a little bit different. And so I just want to put a little plug out there for us to start listening to what people say in wherever country we live in, how those words get used, because you have to learn to kind of become a little bit bicultural, bilingual when you're reading a Dharma book, you're at a Dharma teaching, you're talking with your Dharma friends, and you're just listening to the news and that stuff, because people are using the words very differently. And that's just my little plug. No, and we can talk about that more later for sure, about different words. Oh, that's good. Yeah, glossary. Yeah. That Shayla put in the chat. And another good example is like attachment. In the Western counseling world, we talk about attachment as being good, because you want a baby to attach to its parent or mother in particular. And so a person who has attachment disorders or attachment problems, like can't relate to people, and we don't want that. But that's not the attachment of Buddhism. When they talk about exaggerating something's positive qualities and clinging on to them, that's a different kind of process. So attachment and anger are used differently in Dharma context, non-Dharma context. Yeah. Are there other comments or ideas, or what about the refuge stuff? Does that, I glossed over it, so it wasn't very in depth, but
I thought it was helpful to hear you talk about different ways to understand the word Sangha and what it really means in terms of, especially when you take refuge in the Sangha and what that means versus maybe using it for a group of people. It made sense. And also, I thought there are lay people who are definitely more learned than myself and more practiced and more evolved, who maybe would fit the role of Sangha in some ways, but it's maybe the gray area. But generally, I thought that was a helpful distinction, and a helpful delineation.
And also, when it comes to absolute Sangha versus relative, the way I'm using it in this current talk is the relative is referring to monks and nuns and stuff. But the absolute Sangha is just people that have a realization of emptiness, or of the wisdom wing of things, or someone who has that's really how it's used, as someone who's understanding reality as it is. And that can be a lay person. And so that's where you find in Tibetan Buddhism, you definitely find lay teachers there are Rinpoches that are lay lamas, um, you know, uh, women meditators that are also mothers. I mean, you get all that in Tibetan Buddhism too. It, it's there's a certain kind of respect offered to the people that have taken all those vows because of the vows, because the vows have that lineage that ideally stretches back to the Buddha, and because of that level of commitment. They're special because of the vows that they've taken. Once they don't have the vows anymore and people leave, then they don't get to be a part of that. They're not part of the refuge object anymore, although they certainly have a special experience that we don't have to disregard or anything. But it's the vows that make the person an object, a holy object in a way. It's the power of the lineage, the power of the vows, the power of the commitment. And people can pick that up and put that down, which is, it's unfortunate when it happens, but it happens. And then for the absolute Sangha, it's about the realization in terms of their wisdom. So how much wisdom, what level of, we would say emptiness, what's their level of realization of emptiness have they developed, their understanding of emptiness of self and emptiness of phenomena. Anyway, that's a bigger topic that we can do later, but it's that realization. And once you have that special kind of mind, you're even in some ways, I'm not sure how you would rank them. I mean, that realization of emptiness, I don't want to say anything misleading. I'm not sure how you'd rank them. But that's key, because that realization of reality is what begins to dissolve the process of taking rebirth. It's what is necessary to stop those 12 links, is to have wisdom. And so in a sense, that's even more important than the vows. The vows are for the purpose of creating the causes and conditions by which to have that realization at some point. And so in some ways that realization is more important. But this is just my own thinking now. Don't quote me on this to anyone, but I'm just trying to think, because the vows really are for the purpose of having that realization. So I don't know. I have to think about that one. Yeah. Any other disagreements, criticisms, thoughts and concerns? Okay. You know, one way of looking at refuge is, so you have these refuge objects. When you talk about absolute objects of refuge, the way I've been talking about them today, they're qualities of mind, they're realizations of mind. When the relative, they're somehow embodied or made manifest. So you have the mind of a Buddha versus the historical Buddha. The realizations of embodied, the realizations of the teachings versus the written down or recorded. You see this sort of manifest in physical world versus what occurs in the mind. And so I think that's helpful. We want to respect all of them, and yet it's really helpful to see that the point is to develop the qualities in the mind, and that because we're unable to see people's minds, we have some level of, we should have a healthy level of humility towards other people. And so, for example, we look at a person or a living yeah, a person will say, a human being, and on the outside they might look a certain way or they might behave a certain way. That's a little bit tricky, but we don't know exactly the contents of the minds. We're trying to infer the quality of their mind based on their external presentation. And of course, this is how we just function in the world. I mean, the reason we feel creeped out by people is because we're trying to make a snap judgment for our safety and don't surrender that ability to do that at all. But as we progress through the lamrim, at some point we have to learn to weaken or start to doubt that external. We have to doubt our certainty about what's occurring in other people's minds, unless we have really examined and really thought about it. So I'm trying to give you I want to give you a concrete example. Have you ever met those people? They're kind of wild and disorganized, or sort of they're not polite by one's culture standards, and they're not out there or kooky or whatever. So externally they're kind of out there, but if you give them enough time to reveal themselves, then you see, oh wow, they have a level of generosity that I am not capable of doing right now. So I should honor them for that mental quality, although I'm not going to honor them for every wacky behavior they have. It's helpful to start to be able to do that process. Or you meet someone and they're disorganized and they're poorly dressed and their hair is a mess or whatever, and then you begin to ask them about Buddhist philosophy and they actually know a lot, or they're very patient and they're not disturbed by anyone saying mean things about them ever. You know, it helps us to start to value and to prioritize qualities of mind over external presentations, because ultimately that's what's most important. Why is that most important? Is because even in the Buddhist texts, when you become a Buddha, you're free from afflictive states of mind, anger, attachment, ignorance. You don't have ordinary volitional karma. Everything is done on the basis of your compassion for beings. And what does that and you have the skill and knowledge to help beings through wisdom and so what does that mean in the real world? How are you going to look in the real world? You know, some people are going to need people that are stern, and some people need people that are very gentle, and some people need people that are really interested in sports, and some people are really interested in cooking. And if you're a Buddha, the idea is that you are willing to be whatever it takes to benefit the person based off of your infinite wisdom and understanding of your omniscience, or your understanding of people, and your compassion. So it doesn't matter if someone needs you to be conservative party, you be part of conservative party. If they need you to be part of the liberal party, you be part of the liberal party. Do you see what I mean? It's really stretching ourselves in the spiritual ideal. When you're a Buddha, we don't have to worry about that right now. In the beginning, we just have to start to see through the superficial stuff and try and get to the quality of people's minds. You know, how patient are they? What's their concentration like? What are their ethics like? What's their general, and start prioritizing that over how they smell or something like that. So this is just my little warm up for that. Okay, so so we only have 14 minutes. Were there any other questions or comments, or otherwise I'll just do a sort of dedication. Any other ideas, thoughts? Okay. Okay. So we'll do the dedication. So according to the Buddhist worldview, we've engaged in volitional action, so karmas, and hopefully if those karmas ripen as various levels of happiness, then they're called virtues or virtuous karma. So we've engaged in a variety of virtuous karma according to Buddhist tradition. And in order to protect that karma, because we need to have a human rebirth, a perfect human rebirth. So we want to protect that karma. And we want to contribute to our spiritual project in general. So we protect that by dedicating it. And dedicating is just a wish or a hope, or perhaps you're giving the energy a spin. I sometimes say you're giving it a direction. And it's said that if you give it a direction, a spin, then it's protected from negative karmas in the future, like anger. And you can always draw from it until you've accomplished all your spiritual goals. That's what it's taught. So we dedicate, or we hope, or we wish, or we pray, or whatever word seems most powerful for you, that we dedicate to the long lives of our spiritual teachers. May we, from our side, see them as Buddhas and work to serve them and fulfill their holy wishes in ways that are reasonable for our level of practice. And we dedicate that we are never separated from the Buddha Dharma if we have an interest in Buddha Dharma, which is sometimes the path of described as the path of renunciation, bodhichitta, the pure view on emptiness in 2 stages of tantric practice. So that's just a summary of Tibetan Buddhist practice. And then we can dedicate that all beings that think about us, remember us, dream of us, speak to us, hear our voices, see our bodies, see our images, touch our bodies, hear our names, like us, love us, hate us, up to the point of killing us. May they never be born in lower realms, like we talked about today. May they always achieve a perfect human rebirth, meet a qualified teacher, and become a Buddha as quickly as possible. And we can dedicate that all the environmental problems of this earth instantly cease in order that those who practice spiritual paths can continue practicing peace. Those about to begin practicing may begin peace, and those who have yet to hear of spiritual paths may hear of them in peace. And then we dedicate that all wars, famines, fighting, various forms of oppression, and so forth, all those things instantly cease by virtue of our merit. And then dedicate to all non-human beings, animals and so forth, all the different realms I've described. May they have every kind of happiness, be free from every kind of suffering, and become Buddhas as quickly as possible. And then as we've done this kind of 2-hour meditation and talk, then many people have begun the process of dying or have died. And so if they're able to become well, then may they become instantly well. But if they're not able to become well, then may they transition as smoothly as possible. And may they become enlightened in the intermediate state between lives. And if that's not possible, then they may be reborn human, be qualified spiritual teachers and friends, and become Buddhas as quickly as possible in that lifetime. And then dedicate all institutions that support spiritual practice in human beings on this earth, where they have may institutions have every resource they need, time, money, praise, everything an institution needs to function. They have everything they need. And then we have our own mundane, sort of ordinary needs. So may all beings on this earth have everything they need: food, medicine, clothing, transportation, companionship, and so on. Everything they need, and so that they can practice their spiritual paths. And then we have spiritual goals. So may every being accomplish their spiritual goals. So beings want, well, I'll just talk from a Buddhist perspective. So beings want to become nuns or monks. They want to memorize texts. They want to study. They want to meditate. All the various practices you find in Tibetan Buddhism. May they go on retreat, create holy art, these kinds of things, go on pilgrimage. May they be able to do that without any hesitation. May they have every resource they need to accomplish that. And if we ever find ourselves in a position to help someone accomplish, a spiritual goal, then may we not hesitate to help them. And then at the very least, no matter what happens in our lives, whether we become Buddhist or not, whether we're believe in these things or convinced by these things or not, at the very least, may we have a kind heart, a warm heart, be dedicated to helping others, however we define that, freeing others from suffering, however we define that. At the very least, we can do that. Okay, I'll end just ever so slightly early. Thank you all for coming. I'm obviously feeling better than I was before, so I'm over COVID. I feel much better, and I will see you next week. Okay, and we'll keep going.
Thank you.